Imagine this: African nations, once carved up and colonized by Europe, suddenly flipping the script. What if the former colonies became the new superpowers? I know, it sounds crazy. Colonization was cruel and devastating. Nobody wants to see that repeated. But just picture it for a moment. Instead of African countries relying on billions in foreign aid every year, it's African governments sending relief packages and financial lifelines to Europe. Instead of African leaders hustling for foreign investors, desperate for deals that rarely benefit their people, it's Europe and the West standing in line, pleading for African investment. And instead of Africans risking everything to migrate to Europe for a shot at a better life, it's Europeans boarding flights in droves, chasing new opportunities on African soil. Sounds impossible, right? Well, think again. Because in Central Africa, one country has already turned this wild scenario into reality. Angola, a nation once under Portugal's colonial rule, became the unlikely savior of its former master. So how did a former colony end up rescuing the very empire that once controlled it? Let's dive in. Angola, a nation stretching across southwestern Africa, is one of the continent's true treasure troves. Beneath its soil lie immense riches. It's sub-Saharan Africa's second largest oil producer, right after Nigeria, and the world's fourth largest source of diamonds. During the era of President José Eduardo dos Santos, Angola was far from a perfect state. Corruption was rife, and power sat in the hands of a few. Yet, even under a cloud of controversy, Angola showed the world a fascinating possibility: that an African country could rise so high it might one day become the savior of its former colonial master. To understand how remarkable that is, we need to look back through the centuries. In the 15th century, Portuguese explorers set sail toward Africa's west coast, driven by dreams of wealth and power. By the 16th century, they'd established a settlement in Luanda, securing their grip on the region. For the next 400 years, Portugal ruled Angola, exploiting its people and plundering its resources with brutal efficiency. By 1655, Portugal had annexed territories in Angola, ruling them as colonial possessions. In 1951, Portugal went even further, incorporating Angola as an official overseas province, trying to erase any notion that this land was separate or free. But history had other plans. On November 11, 1975, after 14 years of fierce armed struggle, Angola broke free. The Angolan War of Independence came to an abrupt end when, in April 1974, a leftist military coup toppled Portugal's Estado Novo regime. Overnight, Portugal shifted its stance. The new government halted military operations in its African colonies and announced it would grant them independence without delay. For Angola, centuries of colonial domination finally gave way to the dawn of a new era. And this was just the beginning of a story few could have ever imagined. But freedom didn't bring peace. Instead of a young nation finding its footing, Angola plunged straight into chaos. A brutal civil war erupted, tearing the country apart for nearly 3 decades, until 2002. The seeds of this conflict had been planted long before independence. You see, there wasn't just one single movement fighting against Portuguese colonial rule. There were 3 separate groups, each driven by its own vision, its own ideology, and its own ambitions for Angola's future. While they stood united against their common enemy, the Portuguese, the cracks were hidden beneath the surface. But once they signed the Alvor Agreement in January 1975, the pact that officially granted Angola its independence, those differences exploded into the open. And it wasn't just political squabbling. The disagreements turned deadly, plunging Angola into a civil war that devastated the nation. On one side was the MPLA, the group that seized power in the capital. They were backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, determined to secure a socialist future for Angola. On the other side stood UNITA, determined to wrest control away from the MPLA. They were supported by South Africa and the United States, driven by Cold War fears of communism spreading across Africa. It was this foreign involvement, the hidden hands of powerful nations, that kept the conflict raging far longer than it might have otherwise. And for Angola, the price was staggering. But in 2002, everything changed. José Eduardo dos Santos, Angola's president since 1979, finally defeated the UNITA rebel movement. Decades of bloodshed came to an end. Yet peace did not mean instant prosperity. Angola was a country blessed with oil and diamonds, but the scars of war ran deep. The economy was in ruins. Roads and cities lay in rubble. Families were shattered, and hope was in short supply. After all, Angola had been engulfed in conflict almost non-stop since 1975. Meanwhile, far away in Europe, Portugal, Angola's former colonial master, was charting a different path. Its economy was growing steadily, inching closer to the wealthier nations of the European Union. Back then, Portugal's government viewed President José Eduardo dos Santos as a valuable ally, someone who would safeguard Portuguese interests in Angola's booming oil and diamond sectors. Even though Angola's broader economy was in shambles, money still flowed freely among the country's elites. Just as some African politicians love to stash their fortunes in the grand cities of Paris or London, Angola's wealthy and powerful set their sights on Lisbon. The Portuguese capital became the hotspot for Angolan elites looking to invest in luxury real estate and funnel money out of their homeland. Portuguese lawyers, bankers, and accountants eagerly stepped in to help manage these hidden fortunes. Many in Angola's ruling circles quietly acquired Portuguese passports, securing a safe escape route if things went south back home. Their children enrolled in Lisbon's top private schools, blending seamlessly into Portuguese society. Angola was poor and war-torn, yet its riches were quietly transforming the skyline and the economy of Portugal. And soon, the tables were about to turn in a way nobody saw coming. But then, everything changed. After José Eduardo dos Santos finally crushed the rebel forces, Angola's fortunes took an unexpected and dramatic turn. Global oil prices began to soar. Almost overnight, Angola doubled its oil production, unleashing a torrent of black gold onto the world market. The result was staggering. Angola's GDP skyrocketed, growing more than tenfold. An ocean of money began pouring into the country, transforming it into one of the fastest growing economies on the planet, and the third fastest in all of Africa. Fueled by this flood of wealth, President dos Santos and his government set out on a bold mission. They wanted to rebuild the nation from the ashes of war and elevate Angola's standing on the world stage. Roads were repaved, glittering buildings began to rise, and Luanda, the capital, transformed into one of the most expensive cities in the world. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could stop Angola's ascent. Yet, while Angola's star was rising, a very different story was unfolding in Portugal. Despite being one of the first nations to adopt the euro in 1999, Portugal's economy was floundering. The country stumbled into a series of severe economic slumps. Part of the problem lay in how Portugal handled the foreign capital that poured in after joining the Eurozone. According to analysts, Portugal's underdeveloped credit markets meant that foreign money often ended up in the wrong places, propping up unproductive businesses in sectors that didn't compete globally. As capital flowed into these non-tradable industries, productivity declined, and Portugal's real exchange rate surged. This shift sucked resources away from the vital tradable sectors, leaving the economy vulnerable and weak. Portugal, once the colonial master, was sliding toward crisis, and in a twist of fate, the door was opening for Angola to return the favor and come to the rescue. In simple terms, Portugal's economy was tanking. The Eurozone crisis plunged the country into debt, recession, and the desperate embrace of international lenders. By 2011, Portugal was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It had no choice but to accept a massive bailout, one worth a staggering $100 billion, from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. But there's a cruel catch with IMF loans. Countries that borrow often end up worse off than before. The money comes with strings attached, strict conditions that rarely favor the people on the ground. For Portugal, it meant agreeing to harsh austerity measures. Budgets were slashed, public services were cut, and countless Portuguese citizens found themselves poorer and struggling as the welfare state shrank under the weight of economic reform. So, in a bizarre twist of history, Portugal, once the colonial master, was floundering, while its former colony, Angola, was booming. Angola's economy was awash with oil money, growing at astonishing rates of 5 to 15% a year. Luanda gleamed with new skyscrapers, and the Angolan elite had money to spend and invest. Faced with crisis, Portugal had to swallow its pride and look for help. And guess who it turned to? Angola. the very nation it had once ruled, exploited, and drained for centuries. In a moment that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier, Angola answered the call. It began pouring money into Portugal, snapping up significant stakes across the Portuguese economy, from banking and telecommunications to media and energy. A former colony was now propping up its ex-colonial ruler. History had flipped upside down. At the heart of this remarkable reversal stood a powerful figure, Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of President José Eduardo dos Santos. She was once crowned the richest woman in Africa, and she wasn't just wealthy. She was a key player in Angola's push to expand its influence abroad. In March 2015, Isabel made headlines when she unveiled plans for a massive merger between two of Portugal's major banks, Millennium BCP and Banco BPI. If successful, it would create a new financial titan in Portugal. The deal was more than just business. It was a symbol of how deeply Angolan capital had become entwined with Portugal's fragile economy, still reeling from the Eurozone debt crisis. During these years, Angola poured extraordinary amounts of money into Portugal. So much, in fact, that Angola became the only country in Africa where outward investment was greater than the foreign investment flowing in. The numbers were astonishing. According to the Bank of Portugal, Angolan investments in the country soared from 645 million euros to 1.53 billion euros between 2010 and 2014. Imagine that. An African nation, once colonized and stripped of its wealth, was now sending billions to rescue and invest in a European country that had once ruled it with an iron fist. History wasn't just repeating, it was rewriting itself entirely. According to a French historian, Angola wasn't just investing, it was making a statement. Angola had gained the upper hand and was now demanding recognition, leaving no doubt about where the money was coming from. Sometimes it was so overt, it bordered on humiliation for the Portuguese. One striking moment came in February 2014. Portugal was so strapped for cash, it considered selling off 85 paintings by the famed artist Joan Miró to raise funds. Before the government could finalize its plans, an Angolan millionaire, Rui Costa Reis, stepped forward with an offer to buy them outright. It was a bold, symbolic move, showing just how far the tables had turned. All across Portugal, Angolans became the leading buyers of prestige assets. They snapped up luxury apartments in places like Cascais, acquired old money port wine estates, and kept crisis-stricken luxury restaurants and retail shops afloat. The Angolan presence was everywhere, reshaping the Portuguese economy and society in subtle and not so subtle ways. But it wasn't just Angola's elite making waves. A new Angolan middle class emerged, eager to enjoy the spoils of Angola's oil-fueled boom. Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, became their playground. High-end shops, fine dining, and lavish nightlife thrived on Angolan spending. The influx of Angolan money grew so visible and so significant that it stirred envy and even resentment among local Portuguese citizens. One Portuguese man, Vasco Lourenço, summed up the shifting mood perfectly when he said, "Maybe Angola will colonize us now." In a twist of fate few could have imagined, the once colonized were now the ones with power and a checkbook big enough to prove it. While Angolans were flocking to Portugal, snapping up prime real estate and luxury businesses, another migration was unfolding in the opposite direction. Tens of thousands of Portuguese citizens were heading south, to Angola. Crushed by austerity and soaring unemployment at home, many Portuguese saw Angola's oil-fueled boom as a chance to rebuild their lives. They poured into Angola's cities, finding work in sectors that demanded high skills: construction, marketing, education, and more. In 2013 alone, Portuguese workers living in Angola sent over 304 million euros back to their cash-starved homeland. On the surface, it looked like a story of mutual benefit. But beneath it, the dynamic was more complicated and far less equal. Even though Portuguese migrants were contributing valuable skills and sending home desperately needed cash, their presence in Angola was often viewed as another sign of Portugal's growing dependence on its former colony. It wasn't seen as true cooperation, it was seen as a vulnerability. Angola's influence quickly grew beyond buying properties and businesses. It began reaching into the very heart of Portuguese society. The Angolan elite started building relationships with key figures in Portugal's own elite circles, where politics and business often overlap in quiet back rooms. Whispers spread that Angolan money was flowing into the Portuguese political system, bankrolling political parties and buying influence at the highest levels. The idea that Angola, a former colony, might be shaping the politics of Portugal would have been unthinkable just a few decades earlier. But Portugal didn't push back. Instead, many Portuguese leaders welcomed Angola's involvement. They argued that the country was cash-strapped, its corporations undercapitalized, and Angola's seemingly endless river of oil money was nothing short of a lifeline. In a stunning reversal of history, the fate of Portugal was, at least partly, resting in Angolan hands. Angola pumped so much money into Portugal that, in recent years, the power dynamic flipped in a way few could have imagined. When reports surfaced that Angolan officials were under investigation for corruption in Portugal, Angola didn't stay silent. Instead, it threatened to cut off ties and cut off its lucrative investments. Portugal panicked. The Portuguese foreign minister rushed to issue an apology. Think about that for a moment. When in history have we ever seen a former colonial master apologizing to its former colony? Not out of remorse for past atrocities, but because it desperately needed the colony's money? Yet that's exactly what happened. Portugal didn't want to risk losing Angola's billions. This apology sent shockwaves across continents, igniting debates about how much the world had changed. No one was blind to the reality that Angola's elites were deeply corrupt. The oil boom filled the pockets of the powerful and barely trickled down to ordinary Angolans. For most citizens, life remained harsh and unequal. But the notion that an African country, once forced into subjugation and dependence, was no longer in the position of begging, but was instead the one issuing threats, was staggering. As Portuguese journalist and author Celso Felipe, who wrote The Angolan Power in Portugal, put it, "We had it in our heads that Angola was a poor country that needed to be helped. But suddenly, they were able to help us, and to buy things that we cannot buy. It was like a housekeeper buying your house. That is awkward." And in that awkwardness lay a powerful truth. The world was changing. And so were the stories of power between Africa and Europe. So why was Angola so deeply interested in Portugal? Why pour so much money into rescuing its former colonizer? After all, Angola could have simply stood back and watched Portugal struggle, but it didn't. Instead, it seized the moment, and experts say there were several reasons why. First, Angola saw an opportunity. The economic crisis in Portugal meant that once powerful corporations were suddenly up for grabs at bargain prices. Companies that Angolans could never have dreamed of owning were now within reach. By investing, Angola could slip its interest into the heart of the European economy and, through Portugal, connect more directly with global markets. But there was another layer, something deeper and far more personal. Not all Angolan investments in Portugal made financial sense. Some were outright unprofitable. In fact, some Angolan investors even lost money along the way. So why take the risk? According to historians and economists, Angola's spending spree wasn't just about profits. It was also about settling a historic score. For over 400 years, Portugal ruled Angola with an iron fist, exploiting its people and resources. For wealthy Angolans, buying up slices of the Portuguese economy just one generation after the end of colonialism carried a symbolic weight. It was, in some ways, a quiet revenge. Owning banks, media outlets, and major corporations wasn't just business, it was power. It gave Luanda influence inside Portugal, a kind of soft dominance over the very country that once dominated it. And while many in Portugal resented this new reality, bitterness simmering beneath polite smiles, few dared to criticize openly. Portugal, battered by economic crisis, simply couldn't afford to alienate the one country willing and able to help. In a stunning twist of history, the former colony had become the rescuer. And for Angola, the chance to turn the tables was simply too powerful to pass up. But history wasn't done shifting yet. In 2014, the winds changed again. Global oil prices began to crash, and Angola felt the shockwaves almost immediately. With its oil revenues suddenly slashed in half, President José Eduardo dos Santos had no choice but to hit the brakes on Angola's ambitious infrastructure projects. The impact rippled through society. For the first time in decades, Angola saw an unprecedented wave of social protests. People were frustrated. Dreams of rapid development seemed to fade as quickly as the money disappeared. And it wasn't just Angola that felt the sting. Portugal, too, took a hit. As Angola's coffers dried up, its investments in Portugal slowed dramatically. The financial lifeline that Angola had once thrown to its former colonial master began to shrink. Angola's influence across Portugal started to wane. Then came another monumental change. José Eduardo dos Santos stepped down, ending his long and controversial reign. In his place rose President João Lourenço, who launched a fierce crackdown on corruption, targeting the Dos Santos family and Angola's entrenched elites. Meanwhile, Portugal's economy was finding its feet again. Slowly, steadily, the country began to recover from its crisis, restoring a kind of fragile balance between the two nations. Now, let's be clear. No one is applauding the corruption that drained Angola's wealth or lined the pockets of its elites. But the story of Angola and Portugal reveals something powerful. It shows that African countries are not forever doomed to the margins, begging for aid and trapped in cycles of poverty. Instead, Africa holds the potential to flip the script, to transform from a continent seen as needy into one so wealthy and influential that it becomes the source of foreign investment for the West. It's not an impossible dream. It's a vision waiting to be realized. But to get there, Africa needs strong, visionary leaders, patriotic leaders determined to build prosperity, fight corruption, and claim a rightful place on the global stage. The question is, who will lead that transformation next? Unfortunately, the reality is harsh. The old generation of African leaders simply cannot deliver this transformation. Too many of them are weak, lacking true patriotism or bold ambition. Instead of standing tall for their people, they cower before the West, convinced that challenging old powers will doom their own leadership. But here's the truth, no one likes to say out loud. What has decades of alliance with the West truly brought to Africa? The answer is almost nothing. Despite all the handshakes, summits, and aid packages, many African nations remain trapped in poverty, corruption, and dependence. Yet, Africa is not poor. Far from it. This continent is overflowing with both human talent and rich natural resources. There's no reason Africa cannot flip the narrative, from being seen as a continent always begging for help to becoming the one offering help and investment to the rest of the world. And there's hope. A new generation of African leaders is beginning to emerge. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who seem determined to break free from old patterns, to stand tall, and to chart a new course for their nations. The big question is, can they succeed where others have failed? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge how we see the world.